Great. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you. Hi, guys. It's pretty early for Miguel, way early for Miguel, and it's equally early for us in Pakistan, actually, starting at 9, who are basically only self-employed. So around a few years ago, I started thinking about like how languages, how culture, how rituals and traditional sort of inform our way of thinking, and how much of that is sort of missing from our foresight literature. It is quite a difficult task when you're interacting in different cultures and in different communities, to be able to comprehend from the exact context of where they're bringing in their experiences. Kalām has different nuances. It has foundations in the religious context, but also it has a foundation in different philosophical contexts also. The reason for using Kalām as a way of starting this presentation was like expressions actually play a fundamental role in terms of informing the future's discourse, informing how we interact with one another, informing what kind of narratives do we set up. So storytelling, you've had in the last couple of hours, the summit has had phenomenal speakers, and those of you who've actually been online since the time it actually started, you guys have come across how visual medium, how different techniques, how anticipation actually works effectively in terms of doing futures literacy communication. But at the same time, what's equally important that while we're discussing the current crisis, we need to understand that people all over the world do not share the same level of understanding, the same level of sophistication when it comes to dealing with a crisis. So you have different responses coming from different governments, different responses coming from different community organizations, civil society groups. But not to say the least, but it's amazing how the global community, and especially the foresight community, has come together in the last 2 weeks in order to put together such amazing focus on how do we take things forward. In my humble opinion, this may not be the greatest pause ever. This probably is the greatest reset. And it gives us an amazing opportunity to sort of reset the discourse in which way we want to take the world forward. So Kalām basically captures the way of storytelling, the experiences, and the way it ties up into your own local context. You pick up any dictionary, you pick up any techniques, there would be a meaning of everything and anything. So without any, with all the foundational logics and with all the foundational understanding of how the world is moving and where it would go, interactions between people, interactions between people and their government, interaction between different corporations, different charity organizations, those are very meaningful interaction. What the World Health Organization has to say, had not the World Health Organization declared this as a global pandemic, how differently would we have reacted? How different our responses would have been? So all of these things are very important when we are considering as to what sort of futures literacy work we want to be doing in the future, and how respectful and what level of humility and compassion do we need to move forward in order to take the discourse. So while we stick to the meaning of the way we think about the future, while we pick up on the nuances, while we watch out for the weak signals, while we pick up on the trends, it is equally important to respect people that we're interacting with, because without that, it is highly unlikely that we will be able to move the human kind in a manner and in an equitable, inclusive and diverse manner in which we envision the world to be. When I started this presentation, I sort of mentioned that images are very important. So when we, for the last 2 months, we've been bombarded with information around the virus. So if someone wants to close their eyes and sort of imagine what kind of image comes into your mind when you think about the last 2 months. I mean, there are different images coming from Pakistan. There would be different images. The government is reaching out to the people. So the response has been how the government is trying to actually take care of the poorest of the poor, and how the lockdown has actually facilitated different people interacting with one another and coming up with solutions. So scenarios are playing increasingly an important role, but at the same time, when you're looking at what the post-pandemic situation should look like, we need to consider the fact that a lot of the times we kind of ignore the fact that our creative industries, our creative clusters do not get included in the discourse setting, and that is something very important. Artists and creative poets and philosophers, these people have a very crucial role in terms of building a society, the kind of society you would want your children to grow in. So foresight work, be it from a generational, intergenerational, or intragenerational lens, are you creating a world where you are just looking through the lens of a person who is 60-year-old or a person who's 40-year-old, or are you actually listening into and taking into consideration what are the ideas and the images of a child who is 5 or 6 years old? So do you want to create a world where you can foresee your great-great-grandchildren grow in, or do you sort of foresee a world more for yourself in about 100 years from now? So creating an image, this image that I'm sharing with you is an artwork by Saad Khan. He's one of the famous artists here in Pakistan, and this image actually sort of indicates the quest for knowledge, the quest for truth. And a lot of the work that as foresight practitioners we sort of do is we try and dig in to the minutest and the most complex details of the issues, and rather than paintbrushing them as a blanket approach for people all across the world, we do realize that if you are 7 billion people today, and almost roughly around half of that population is in some form of a lockdown, these people have different futures, different interpretation of how they want to see their lives. So it's very important to understand that while you're interacting with these communities, the sort of image that they hold for their own future becomes a very fundamental entry point into understanding and designing your responses in a manner that can be understood by them. So, so the image of the language. There are thousands of language, and you know, while I was diving deeper into what could this concept could potentially mean, I came across that there is I think there is Papua New Guinea, and Kalām happens to be their language. I didn't know this, and what I found fascinating, like although this is something that has originated in the whole idea of how do we shape this originated from out of Islamabad, but the fact that this language actually exists in a way of communication in in a very far off distant place was kind of very was very surprising to me, and then you'd have different images from those countries, and the way people actually share their culture and beliefs are equally important. So the image of how you use the languages and how you interact with one another, and how do you scope that into your understanding, the cultural underpinnings, I think what drives the discourse in a much more meaningful manner. There is this increasing discussion, at least around the Asia Pacific foresight community, is actually, and also in some cases, I mean, the Millennium Project for which I host and chair the Pakistan node, discusses this. How is it important of being in an era of conscious technology? So how do you be in order to solve long-term challenges? So this time that we have gained, I think this time should be used in a much more meaningful manner into also discovering ourselves, what is important to us to exist, what is important to our environment, and how do we connect those dots in order to make things moving forward. So it really has to trigger from within, how if you want to solve the global long-term challenges. But one of the fundamental factors that I've been sort of hearing every now and then, and in a conversation yesterday just around the post COVID-19 scenarios, anticipatory governance took good momentum of how do you take these, how do you improve the level of preparedness within public institution, within community groups, within young volunteers who want to solve these issues right away. Trust plays a fundamental role. How do you take on responsibility as a foresight practitioner? How do you get how do you hold yourself accountable to the work? I mean, the practitioners within this realm, we don't promise, we don't make those promises that this is the future this is the future that you would have. Rather, we talk in alternatives, that these are the choices, these are the possibilities that if you make certain choices today would perhaps lead you to. So trust in essence plays a fundamental role in terms of shaping that conversation, in terms of shaping that discourse, in terms of building that network of communities that you would want to engage with. What we've seen happen in the last couple of days, that it is phenomenal how people from different communities have come together and have shared best experiences. I mean, this is only made possible. So yesterday, what we realized that perhaps technology is we were talking about who will be the winners and who will be the losers is on in this entire crisis situation, and there was some remote consensus around technology becoming technology is eventually one of the winners. And so I feel that using this concept as a way of understanding the interaction amongst ourselves, understanding the interaction between organization, between governments, is a fundamental tool to actually build the kind of future, or build or envision the kind of image you want for the future when you're thinking about your great-great-grandchildren. Miguel, I would stop here. Do you suppose I should take the questions?
Yes, you can take the question. There is one question on the Q&A, and you can also start the conversation if you want to initiate anything with the attendees. You can ask directly, and they can contribute more questions to you.
So, what contribution from Kamal to make a foresight discourse more human? Let's say that human component is put into the center, not technologies. Yelena, thank you so much. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Yelena, thank you so much for your question. The whole purpose of actually building around this concept is to make foresight work more human-centric rather than disconnected, and we use technology as we should see technology as a way of enabling the civilizations to sort of interact with one another more so, and use technology as a means to do it. So when you say how do you make it more human-centric, it actually boils down to how do you see yourself as a being? Do you see yourself completely hooked on to technology and then actually looking for answers using that technology, or do you use the technology to find the truth that sort of makes us more human, connects more of us, and then sort of perhaps using a more of a technical, extrapolate the sort of a vision that you sort of want the future to look like? Yes, Yelena, I will just, I didn't get to see Miguel's presentation, but I did see the topic that he presented. And yes, it's very close to narratives. Storytelling has a fundamental role. In terms of communicating the right ideas at the right time and speaking to the right people. A lot of the time people would come to me and sort of say, like, you need to involve more like-minded groups. But I sort of believe that you have to also cater to the people who do not think like you. So thinking of people from opposite end of poles would actually serve in terms of improving your own understanding. So if you Andrea, if you talk about experience as a trust, I think it is more of a question of like how much collaboration can one do as an organization, as an entity, but also how much of collaboration are you willing to do as an individual? So it sort of comes down to, are you open to new experiences? And if not, and I'll give you one short example. There are foresight communities all over the world. So you will always have this, if I just pick up from the West and the East, from what Yelena, there is a Western way of doing foresight work, but there is also a predominant Eastern way of doing foresight work. And I do realize you have Sohail Inayatullah coming later in the day, and he's perhaps is going to build more around that. How culture, how rituals, how tradition play a fundamental role in terms of how the Eastern culture or how the Eastern foundations are developed. So the narrative that comes from the East is very different from the narrative that you get from the West. But as a way of how do then the question becomes, how do you bridge that gap? If there is a gap between West and the narratives of the West and the East, so do you use frameworks like Sustainable Development Goals, which the governments around the world have signed up? Do you use climate change as an approach to bringing those? So there are some fundamental narratives that are already out there that play a role of how do you bridge if there is a divide, how do you bridge if there is a conflict. So, so the experiences and the narratives, all of these sort of combine together. But I would sort of go back on what I'd said earlier, that in this process, the creative industries have a huge role to play. So, for instance, as we move forward, will the corporate giants, will huge corporate entities, and will they subscribe to social values? I mean, would you buy a product or a brand that is more inclined towards just selling you the product or the brand, or would you buy into the experience and the kind of values they align? So trust sort of also emerges as a foundation of as how do you make an individual, or how do you make an individual convinced that as an entity, whether you're doing it for show or whether you're doing it for selling purposes, how do they interact with your product, or how do they interact with your service? In the last 2 weeks, I think there is at least in some of the cases, there has been a sudden surge. There's a huge demand for entertainment. How do you actually cater to entertainment needs of different population? Yuval Harari said something very fascinating a couple of years ago in his book. What if there is a useless class of society? What if there are so many people, low skilled or skilled labor force, who do not know or who do not have a purpose in life? So how do you do that? So if your bulk, predominantly much of the discussion last year, even around future of work, had been like, what if technology replaces human sort of driven work? And then the question sort of arises, will there be an emergence of a useless class? And if that happens to be the case, do you find new meanings? And that goes back to what human values do we put in place so that we, in order to not allow technology overtaking the whole discourse. And I think in the last 2 weeks, we've seen how the crisis situation has actually made us do that. Rosemary, thank you so much. There is this, so I'm part of the founding member of this network called Plurality University Network, based out of Paris. If you just look at the way that they're organizing foresight thinking in terms of how they're bringing in the creative industry, that would actually help you understand how they're using artifact and images of the future, whether be it the utopian image, the dystopian image, or an abstract way of thinking in terms of pushing the foresight discourse forward. But also at the same time, you'd see how artificial intelligence is being used. I mean, there are a few artists even in Pakistan that I work with. I mean, they're using artificial intelligence in order to generate a more computerized version of an artistic work. So I think when you say like, how do technical, it is rather difficult to actually get technical professionals to collaborate and cooperate with the creative industry. And the reason I say this is because predominantly they both come from different experiences and different educational background. And as foresight practitioners, because we understand that, or we should understand that, we as a network, we as a community can actually bridge that gap. And more so, we've been doing it increasingly over the past 2-3 years. Miguel, if there are not any more questions, should I just open up the discussion if anyone wants to contribute? I mean, I would love to develop on this, because all these ideas are very important. The questions are very important, and it would help me sort of evolve.
Yes, you can start. You can start the conversation whenever you want. So look at the chat and the Q&A, and you have in both places.
Okay, so let me just future value of money or human, if you comment. I think money follows where humans are. So, I mean, if there weren't any humans, there won't be any point of money. But that's just my view. Not necessarily. There was this one debate where we in a futures conference, there was this one debate where we kind of like said like, okay, what if money did not exist? What kind of a future are we looking at? So are we going back to with the barter and the trade system? How do we redefine? But that was a very dense conversation. It was very intense. It wasn't well regarded. But I think there was some thinking around that idea happening in any case. So how do I open this talk?
The only way is for you to speak, and they will be answering either in the chat or the Q&A. They cannot contribute by talking.
Okay. So I just have one question, guys. In whatever sort of work that you do, how much of trust actually informs your way of thinking about the decisions that you take? And that's just like an open question. I mean, it would help me understand like how useful this component is in terms of informing the sort of decisions we take. Miguel, about your presentation. So how much what were the components that you sort of think are relatable in terms of the presentation that I just gave?
Basically, everything, the whole concept about the storytelling and narratives that are being directed to change the way you think about the future. For example, one of the things I was talking about is how we are using the current pandemic by basically the media is being used as a death toll game. Who is winning? Who is counting more dead people in the ranking? Who is going first? Who is more prepared? And that creates a whole narrative of fear, and not of atmosphere of fear, that it's making people scared of the world outside them. And it's just the way you propose what is going on that is going to shape the way they think. And so when changing the way they think, they are going to change the expectations of the future.
Oh, that's because we actually we had a lot more yesterday. We had a lot more conversation about like how we are now seeing the expectation, the demand for delivering public goods is coming up over and over again. And so there is greater expectation from the governments, but there are greater expectation from leadership also. Trust reduces the cost of enforcement. It is important when leaders are trying to get public to cooperate. I work in at least two cultures, one in which trust. Andrea, I think when you work into two cultures, what do you find that actually is more closer to who you are as a person? I mean, would it be the culture where trust is embedded, or would there be a culture where no experience of the trust? So which of the two cultures that you would closely associate yourself to? And Rosemary, I completely agree that the cost of enforcement greatly reduces if you get the public to cooperate. But so, for instance, if you take the West and East discourse, the Eastern way of doing things is very different from the Western way of doing things. But what the current crisis have shown us that we have almost the same level of response gaps. So how, in your opinion, how do you get the public to cooperate in different cultures? And perhaps how do you get them to cooperate? What tools do you have?
Hi, so in my case, it's the culture in which I work, not the culture from whom I'm coming, let's say. So the culture that has embedded trust, but then it made me curious. That's why I also asked you, how did they start it with trust? Because there it's embedded, there is no discussion, no.
So yeah, so from the foresight perspective, when you're working with individuals who have a diverse background. So when I said that it's very difficult to get the technical folks to sort of cooperate with the creative industry, the only reason is that there is the way the language is so different between the two. it almost feels nerve-wracking to actually build the bridge. But what can happen in essence is that if the practitioner, if the foresight practitioner is able to build that trust between those two communities, it's easier to find the image. It's easier to even create the image for the future. And in some cases, like even in sometimes when you have to deliver a task, trust may not be such an important factor. But if you were to live in communities, and if you were to interact with a lot of people, and if your work depended on it, and your research, and in my case, my research work depends on it, then trust plays a very fundamental role as to how we engage with other people. Andrea, did that make sense?
A lot. I work with teachers, so it's a lot of collaboration. It made me smile. Yes, of course, it made a lot of sense and value. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you so much. So yeah, I mean, I think the more you, I mean, it's rather difficult actually. I mean, you're working in the education, if you're working in the education sector, how we're dealing with, you have like a regulator, you have universities, and then you have the faculty, and then you have students, and you have an entire administration. When such a crisis happens, we realize we weren't prepared for it. So how do you continue with the education? So a lot of us actually went back to, towards online training, online lectures, and all of those things. So, and there are a lot of, what I feel like there are a lot of lessons there that I think governments and public institutions could actually learn from. And a lot of research work could happen as a result of this. Post-COVID-19 societies will be evaluated by growth. So post-COVID, I think a lot more focus in the last couple of weeks have been around immune system, like whether or not our immune system are geared towards actually handling such a health crisis. I think well-being is going to accelerate the way we think about life and the way we think about growth and potential. So maybe I'm hoping that should be the most preferred scenario that we should lead into. But then there are always competing interests. There are always other factors which are far more complex, they are far more nuanced, that would be playing in. A bigger problem is how to build trust. Rosemary, that is so fantastic. You know. I think we need to try and understand what makes sense to millennials and Gen Z. Yes, they do have a subculture of their own. I'll give you, so I have a baby sister, maybe like, and she has her own culture. She does not interact over Facebook. She does not interact on other platforms that are considered like for our generation. She interacts on Instagram and other platform, which has so time is of the essence. Let me just put it that way. Time is important. Do you have their attention? So if you have the attention of the millennials and Gen Z, you should be doing it in a language and in a manner that makes sense to them. And so we like to believe that we live in our own sense bubble. And that sense bubble often at times does not work because the language that we use often perhaps becomes obsolete. So we need to understand and we need to be better equipped as to what makes sense to millennials and Gen Z. And why is it that happening? So even if it's electronically and not as socially connected, perhaps that's their way of being socially connected. And so the meaning of how social connectivity, how social values evolve, it seems to me that there'll be new traditions around this. And there's predominantly subcultures is going to dominate a lot of the opinion when you look at the demographic trends. So it's a much more bigger and broader debate. But it's actually a problem, not just in one part of the world. It's actually a common problem. House and Lee, do you have any advice for a 22-year-old? Yes. I think in North America, there are phenomenal people working in the foresight community. One of the organizations that I actually am also a part of is the Millennium Project. I would suggest you look them up, and if you need any help in terms of interacting with the team there, I could. You're more than welcome to reach out, and I'd help you out there. You're welcome, Housen. So, Rosemary, I just have a question, because what you said is extremely important. What are the difficulties that you face when you're trying to do something of the sort where there are millennials and Gen Z involved?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, actually, I'm from the Philippines. And in the Philippines, the median age is actually 23, 24 years old. So it's a very young population. But of course, our leadership are those in the 70s, in the 60 years old. So there's really that problem that, the leaders are so used to just putting out the rules and then expecting all the constituents to just follow, and it turns out that amongst the young, that is not the case, and so we're now actually trying to get into this, so using social media as a platform to be able to communicate policies even, and also to be able to influence the narratives there. Except that sometimes they use a different language, and so again, we need to keep ourselves updated of the latest language. We try. You're right that we need to also get into this electronic socialization, but it's still difficult because, like I said, because of that natural generation gap.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, I'm coming back to you, do you think the leadership in Philippines recognizes this gap?
Well, the very, very top leadership, probably not. They're already in their 70s. But you have the middle level leadership that kind of knows how to, straddle this two different generations, and it makes it, of course, even more challenging.
That's fantastic. I mean, the fact that there is a recognition, even if it's within a particular demographic, in the leadership environment, where you are sort of thinking about how best to engage the young generation. I'll give you an example. The way the leadership does it in Pakistan, we have youth committees, we have youth forces at a parliamentary level, at subcommittee levels, researchers that are constantly working. And even though our prime minister would be much older, but his cabinet is not that old. So there is a great deal of influences that comes from within the house. When you have young children, and I think in the post-COVID, even during this whole crisis, we've seen different provincial leadership actually taking up animation a very simple script animation as a way of communicating, of how to prevent oneself from getting infected, how to prevent infecting others. So a lot of good artistic work had actually been used. A lot of data has been used in Pakistan. There is a constant demand for data, so that people are more informed about like what do the trends indicate, and which direction is it most likely to move in. So the discussion no longer remains, even if you're looking at the storytelling, the discussion no longer remains at just a metaphorical level. It becomes very concrete when you're engaging with the young generation. And this is the young generation. This is the demographic around 25 to 30-year-old that I'm talking about. They are the ones who are actually stepping up and are demanding for clean data, a clean insight, more updated leadership, and are demanding more effective communication at the same time. So with this wave, we actually do see how civil society is participating and actually adding value to the entire discourse. So just as a broad question, I mean, what do you think is the most difficult aspect that you have actually faced during this entire crisis? I mean, in your own line of work, what was the most difficult aspect that you faced?
Are you asking me?
Oh, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I guess the problem we're now facing is we're familiar with all these epidemiological models that says when the peak is gonna happen here, and what are the projected number of cases, deaths, etc., etc. So right now the debate really amongst the policymakers is this something that we can inform the public about? Would there be some public, some hoarding that could happen, a panic response, which will actually make things worse? So for us, that's the, but of course, like you said, the millennials are actually the ones who crave for the data. But you still have the other part of the population that is, would rather not really know about the real bad news. So I guess that balancing that between the needs of these different generations.
Oh yeah, that's exactly. I mean, I think this is one of the increasing the whole bridging part, and the language part is one of the areas. In our case, some are doing it really effectively. In most cases, they're lost in translation. Like, how do you convey information about a disease that scientifically would make more sense for a scientific community, but there lies a communication challenge. So who does it if your leadership is not even prepared to communicate so communication becomes a very important aspect within the leadership. Like, if a crisis hits, how do you communicate a crisis to a larger population that makes sense? So yeah, that's a very, very important point. Compassionate challenge, you were talking as well. So yes, it's rather difficult if you are working with people who think differently, who have a different set of values. But you shouldn't, in my experience, you shouldn't alienate them from your discussion. I mean, they should be as much involved as the people who share the same values. And so there does come a point in futures thinking where sometimes, rather than looking for divergences in narrative, you find the converging aspects within those narrative. So remaining humble, remaining compassionate along the process, it actually goes a long way.